There is a hush that falls over the highlands of central Anatolia as the sun slips beneath the curve of the earth, a quiet so deep it feels like the land is listening. Rolling hills stretch like waves of dry grass and stone, ancient pine forests whisper in the wind, and the ruins of time-worn walls rest gently beneath a blanket of earth. This was once the heart of a great empire, but today it speaks only in fragments. The Hittites did not leave behind golden tombs or towering statues. They carved no grand monuments to their own greatness. What they left instead were stone foundations, clay tablets, and the residue of power, the kind that shaped diplomacy, warfare, religion, and myth across 2 continents. Their story doesn't rise loudly like that of Egypt or Babylon. It emerges gradually, like the morning mist lifting from a quiet river valley. The land they ruled, Anatolia, the spine of modern-day Turkey, was a crossroads of culture and conflict. Rugged and beautiful, it cradled civilizations long before the Hittites and long after them. But it was the Hittites who, for a brief moment in time, transformed it into the seat of one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world. When their empire collapsed around 1200 BCE, it left behind a silence, a pause in history. For nearly 3,000 years, no one remembered their name. Even in the great libraries of Greece and Rome, the Hittites were no more than shadows, a vague people mentioned in passing, if at all. And then, in the 19th century, something remarkable happened. European travelers and archaeologists exploring the highlands near Bogazkale began uncovering strange ruins. Massive fortifications, lion-shaped gates, and tablets covered in undeciphered symbols. At first, these were thought to belong to some offshoot of Assyrian culture. But the language was different, the structure was different, and the sheer scale hinted at something far more significant. Clay by clay, word by word, the Hittites began to speak again. What we now know is that they ruled an empire that stretched from the Aegean to the edge of Mesopotamia. They fought Egypt in one of the largest chariot battles in history. They signed the world's oldest known peace treaty. They were both warriors and scholars, builders and mystics, diplomats and dreamers. And yet they vanished, almost completely, as if swallowed by the earth itself. This series is not just a chronicle of the Hittites. It is an invitation to listen to the quiet voices of history, to trace the shape of a forgotten power etched in stone and silence, to rediscover a people who helped shape the ancient world, and then disappeared, leaving behind only whispers. So let us begin, not with noise, but with stillness, with open ears and patient eyes. Because history doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. Long before they were kings, the Hittites were wanderers. Their story begins not in palaces or temples, but in movement, quiet migrations across the Eurasian steppe, through mountain passes and river valleys, carried by herds and seasons. They were part of a larger tapestry of Indo-European tribes, whose languages would one day echo across half the world. But in this early chapter, they were just a people in search of land, of permanence, of identity. Sometime around 2000 BCE, small groups began settling in the high plateaus of central Anatolia. They arrived not as conquerors, but as settlers, blending with the native Hattians, an older, deeply rooted culture whose language and customs had shaped the region for centuries. The newcomers learned from them. They adopted their gods, absorbed their building styles, and even kept the name of their land, Hutti. Yet something was changing. By the 17th century BCE, the outlines of a new civilization were taking shape. The Indo-European newcomers began consolidating power, organizing cities, and expanding influence. Among these early leaders was a man named Labarna, whose rule marked the beginning of a dynasty that would rise like a slow tide over Anatolia. Soon after, a bold king named Hattusa made a symbolic and strategic move. He founded a new capital, Hattusa, on a rocky promontory surrounded by forests and hills. It was a dangerous place, once destroyed in war, but he rebuilt it into a center of resilience. From this city, the Hittites would begin their transformation from tribal kingdom to imperial force. They did not erase what came before. They layered over it. Hattusan words remained embedded in their prayers. The native gods were kept, honored alongside the foreign ones. This syncretic approach, blending, adapting, absorbing, would become a defining trait of the Hittite civilization. As their kingdom expanded, so did their language. Known as Nesali, it was carved into clay tablets using borrowed cuneiform from Mesopotamia. It's the oldest known Indo-European language ever recorded, and it marks the Hittites as one of the first to commit their words and their world to written memory. Yet despite their rise, they were still cloaked in mystery. There were no great origin myths, no grand claims of divine ancestry. Their presence in history is subtle, like the quiet arrival of dawn before the light fully spills over the hills. The Hittites did not seem to crave spectacle. They preferred endurance, slow, steady accumulation of power and knowledge. And so, from the mists of time, the Hittites emerged. Not with a roar, but with footsteps, with stone, with tablets, with a quiet, deliberate will to build something that would last. They were no longer wanderers. They were becoming a people of empire. At first glance, the hills around Bogazkale seem unassuming, rolling, quiet, windswept. But if you listen closely, if you let your eyes adjust to the rhythm of ancient time, you'll begin to see the outlines of something immense, the bones of a forgotten capital, once alive with the sounds of rituals, politics, and power. This was Hattusa, the heart of the Hittite Empire. Perched on a high promontory above fertile valleys, Hattusa wasn't built for beauty, though it has a kind of rugged elegance. It was built for purpose, for protection, for endurance. A city designed as a statement, "We are here to stay." Its walls stretched for miles, snaking up hills and across ridges like the spine of a stone dragon. 5 monumental gates guarded the city, each one carefully placed for symbolic and strategic value. The most famous is the Lion Gate, where twin guardian beasts, carved from single blocks of rock, still glare out at the landscape, their expressions worn by wind and time. Inside the city, things become more intricate. Hattusa was not chaotic like some ancient capitals. It had zones, sacred precincts, residential areas, administrative quarters, storehouses. Everything had its place. At its center stood the great temple, a massive complex dedicated to the storm god and the sun goddess, the spiritual core of the Hittite world. Beneath the temple, archaeologists discovered vast underground storerooms, stacked once with grain, oil, and ritual items. These weren't just places of worship, they were hubs of activity. Here, priests prepared offerings, scribes composed prayers in multiple languages, and oracles whispered guidance to kings. Scattered throughout the city were thousands of clay tablets, Hittite law codes, letters to foreign rulers, hymns, prophecies, treaties. Some were written in Hittite, others in Akkadian, Sumerian, Hurrian, reflecting a multicultural empire that embraced complexity rather than avoiding it. And yet, for all its grandeur, Hattusa never forgot the natural world. The city seems to breathe with the land. Its walls follow the contours of the hills. Sacred groves and spring-fed sanctuaries dot the terrain. Stone tunnels run beneath key gates, allowing ceremonial processions to move in shadow before emerging into sunlight. Perhaps most haunting of all is the silence of Hattusa today. Unlike other ancient sites, it doesn't overwhelm. It whispers. You can walk among its ruins and feel the rhythm of daily life, footsteps in dust, voices echoing off stone, the distant roll of a chariot wheel. And as the sun sets over the Anatolian plateau, casting long shadows across broken walls and crumbling thresholds, you begin to understand, Hattusa wasn't just a city. It was a world, self-contained, sacred, and strong. A city of stone. A city of silence. But never truly forgotten. Power in the Hittite world did not come from gold or conquest alone. It came from the skies, from thunder, lightning, and the great unseen rhythms of the cosmos. At the center of it all stood a divine figure, ever watchful, ever present, Tarhun's, the storm god. He was the bringer of rain, the giver of crops, the voice in the clouds, and the Hittite king was his chosen vessel on earth. To rule, a king did not simply inherit a throne. He inherited a covenant, an intimate and binding relationship with the gods. Hittite monarchs were not worshipped as deities like the pharaohs of Egypt, but they walked a fine line between mortal and divine agent. They were mediators between heaven and earth, responsible for keeping the cosmic balance, known as Ishtar, a harmony between gods, humans, and nature. This role was both sacred and crushing. Each king began his reign with a solemn ritual of renewal, reaffirming loyalty to the gods and to the people. He was expected to lead in war, yes, but also in law, agriculture, religion, diplomacy. His word became royal edict, but he was also bound by tradition, a living continuation of what his ancestors had established. Their names, Hattusili, Mursili, Suppiluliuma, Tudhalia, carry the echo of thunder. These were not ornamental kings. They were strategists, reformers, spiritual leaders. They prayed before campaigns, offered sacrifices after harvests, and were often the first to speak when foreign dignitaries arrived at court. In times of crisis, they turned to oracles and divine signs, interpreting the flight of birds, the movement of clouds, the dreams of priests. Entire wars could be paused or redirected based on the will of the gods as revealed through ritual. But it wasn't all solemnity. There was warmth and family, too. Letters between kings and their queens show moments of affection, stress, even humor. And some queens, such as Pujahipa, wife of Hattusili III, held astonishing power. Pujahipa negotiated treaties, led religious reforms, and corresponded with pharaohs on equal terms. This divine kingship, though deeply spiritual, was also deeply pragmatic. It gave the Hittite rulers authority that transcended tribe, region, and language. It bound diverse populations under a shared mythology, one in which the storm god reigned and the king served his will on earth. But there was always risk. If the land withered, if the skies withheld rain, if enemies approached and omens turned dark, the king stood exposed. Not just as a ruler, but as a man who may have fallen out of sync with the gods. And in those moments, even a great king could become a scapegoat. This sacred power was no crown to wear lightly. It was a weight, sometimes glorious, sometimes unbearable, carried on the shoulders of the storm god's chosen. To walk through a Hittite city was to move through a living mosaic of faith, a spiritual world as vast and layered as the mountains of Anatolia themselves. Every river had a soul, every hill a spirit, every storm a voice. In the eyes of the Hittites, the world was not filled with gods, it was made of them. They called it the pantheon of 1,000 gods. But in truth, there may have been far more. The Hittites didn't just worship their own deities. They welcomed the gods of every city, every conquered land, every people under their rule. Each new god was absorbed, catalogued, and given a place in the celestial order. It wasn't religious tolerance in the modern sense. It was something older, more mystical, the belief that all divinity deserved reverence. At the center of this sprawling pantheon stood Tarhans, the storm god, fierce and just, rider of clouds and bringer of rain. Beside him, his consort Arina, the sun goddess, brought light, order, and law. Together, they governed the balance of heaven and earth, fertility and justice, wind and flame. But the divine family did not stop there. There were gods of oaths and war, gods of gates and fields, river gods and mountain goddesses, hearth spirits, sky serpents, ancestors, demons, and protectors. Some gods were inherited from the older Hattusa culture. Others came from Hurrian, Luwian, or Mesopotamian influences. The Hittites did not erase difference. They collected it, stacking divine identities like layers in a tapestry. This rich complexity flowed into daily life. Each city had its patron deity, each household its personal spirits. Farmers offered grain to the earth god before plowing. Soldiers prayed to war gods before battle. The king himself made regular offerings at sacred sites across the kingdom, part devotion, part diplomacy, part ritual necessity. Rituals were everywhere, carefully preserved in clay-text libraries. We have records of entire festivals, some lasting weeks. Processions, sacrifices, songs, shared feasts. The gods were not distant beings to be feared. They were neighbors. Powerful, yes, but also personal. You fed them, thanked them, spoke to them. Some deities even had personal relationships with specific rulers, intervening in dreams, offering signs, demanding temples. Others appeared in epic myths, gods struggling against chaos serpents, negotiating fates, tricking one another, dying and returning. These stories weren't just entertainment. They reflected the cosmic balance the Hittites believed in, order always fighting back against disorder. But with so many gods, how did the people keep track? They wrote them down, in long lists. They stored their names in sacred archives, carved them into temple walls. They even had backup rituals in case a priest forgot a specific god's name. Just pray to the gods, known and unknown. That, perhaps, is the most telling glimpse of all. The Hittites understood the world as a mystery too large to be fully mapped. They honored what they knew and respected what they didn't. In their pantheon, there was always room for one more name, one more story, one more sacred thread in the divine web of existence. And in that way, they left us a theology of humility. Not the arrogance of knowing every god, but the wisdom of listening for those not yet heard. The Hittites were not just warriors and worshippers. They were record-keepers, methodical, multilingual, and meticulous. Long before paper, before printing, before digital clouds and silicon circuits, they etched their thoughts into the earth itself. Their words were pressed into clay, dried in the sun, and stored in great libraries, the silent servers of the ancient world. Their language was called Nesali, named after the city of Nessa. It was one of the earliest written Indo-European languages, a distant cousin to Latin, Greek, and even modern English. But instead of developing their own alphabet, the Hittites borrowed an older tool, cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script of Mesopotamia. Using foreign symbols to express a native tongue was no small task. Imagine trying to write English using Chinese characters. Not impossible, but complex. The Hittite scribes rose to the challenge. They created hybrids, shortcuts, and conventions to mold cuneiform into something uniquely theirs. And they didn't stop at one language. Hattusa's royal archive contains texts in Akkadian, Sumerian, Hurrian, Luwian, and more. This wasn't linguistic chaos, it was intentional. The Hittite court was a multilingual powerhouse, communicating with Egypt, Assyria, and other neighbors through a shared diplomatic script, while also preserving internal traditions in their own native tongue. But language was more than communication. It was law. Some of the most remarkable tablets found in Hattusa are not myths or letters, they're legal codes. Hittite law was surprisingly detailed and, by the standards of its time, often humane. It covered everything from theft and property rights to marriage, inheritance, and even veterinary care. Unlike the harsh eye for an eye codes of Babylon, the Hittite system leaned toward compensation over punishment. Fines were common. Executions were rare. Women had property rights. Slaves could earn freedom. And crimes against animals or the environment were taken seriously, as if the sacred balance extended beyond just human society. The king served as the ultimate judge, but he was not above the law. In fact, many laws were revised over time, edited, updated, reconsidered. This suggests not only a functioning bureaucracy, but a society capable of self-reflection. Perhaps most fascinating of all are the treaties, complex, multi-clause agreements between kings, sealed with oaths to the gods. These documents included clauses about peace, trade, military alliances, and mutual respect. The most famous, of course, is the Treaty of Kadesh with Egypt, a document that still survives on the walls of Egyptian temples and in Hittite clay. Words were sacred. To write was to remember. To codify was to protect. And so the Hittites gave their empire not just structure and strength, but a voice, one pressed into the clay of Anatolia and left to dry beneath the sun, where it would wait patiently for millennia to be read once more. To build an empire in the ancient world, one needed more than vision and diplomacy. One needed strength. And the Hittites, though masters of negotiation and ritual, were no strangers to the blade. Their empire was carved not only in clay, but in bronze and fire, across battlefields echoing with the thunder of hooves and the clash of chariots. The Hittites did not invent the chariot, but they perfected its use in war. Their design was lighter than those of their rivals, with a three-man crew, a driver, a shield-bearer, and a warrior. This configuration gave them an advantage in both offense and defense, a mobile platform for archery, close combat, and rapid communication. From the rugged highlands of Anatolia, they launched campaigns that reached the coasts of the Aegean and the cities of Syria. They fought with discipline and calculation, not just brute force. Records describe careful strategies, alliances with vassal states, and the use of military intelligence to anticipate enemy movements. Their army was well organized, with clearly defined ranks and regional levies. Chariots led the charge, but foot soldiers, equipped with spears, swords, and shields, followed in formation. Siege warfare, ambushes, river crossings, the Hittites adapted to terrain and enemy alike. One of their key innovations was their relationship with metal. Though the Iron Age had not fully begun, the Hittites were among the earliest to experiment with ironworking, using it for ceremonial blades and elite weapons. Bronze still dominated, but the seeds of the next era were already being forged in Hittite fires. War, for the Hittites, was not just a political tool. It was also a spiritual test. Before every major campaign, the king would consult oracles, offer sacrifices, and seek omens. If the signs were unfavorable, he might delay, or cancel the campaign altogether. Victory, in their view, came not just from numbers or steel, but from divine alignment. And when battles were won, spoils were taken, but order was expected. The Hittites often installed loyal governors, demanded tribute, and absorbed local gods into their vast pantheon. Their conquest was rarely about destruction. It was about integration. Still, war left its mark. Entire cities were burned. Populations displaced. Borders redrawn again and again. The Hittite kings walked a narrow path, always balancing strength with stability, aggression with appeasement. They were not conquerors for glory. They were architects of a durable empire, and warfare was one of their most precise tools. Power does not always march in armor. Sometimes it rides in the form of sealed tablets and spoken promises, carried not by soldiers, but by emissaries and scribes. For all their military might, the Hittites were equally, and perhaps more enduringly, defined by their diplomatic genius. They stood at a crossroads of civilizations. Egypt to the south, Babylon to the east, Mycenaean Greece to the west, and the nomadic tribes of the north. Instead of attempting to dominate all, the Hittites built a system of alliances, vassal states, treaties, and correspondence that allowed them to project influence across an astonishing range without constant war. At the center of this web was the Hittite king, not merely as conqueror, but as great king, a title that had to be recognized by his peers. Only a handful of rulers in the ancient world were granted that distinction: the Pharaoh of Egypt, the king of Babylon, the king of Assyria, and the king of Hittites. This was not a self-proclaimed title. It was earned through respect, negotiation, and reputation. Dozens of letters from foreign courts survive, preserved in baked clay. In them, we hear the language of statecraft at its most human: kings complaining of insult, proposing marriages, offering gifts, reaffirming bonds. There is careful etiquette. A wrong title or missing tribute could spark offense. And yet, woven between the formalities are genuine moments of curiosity, rivalry, even friendship. One of the most fascinating relationships was with Egypt. After years of tension, war, and the monumental Battle of Kadesh, the Hittites and Egyptians reached a turning point. They signed what is widely considered the first known peace treaty in history, a bilingual, bilateral agreement that detailed non-aggression, mutual defense, and the extradition of fugitives. The treaty even invoked the gods of both sides as witnesses, an act of sacred diplomacy, binding each side under divine scrutiny. A copy of this treaty still hangs in the United Nations headquarters today, a quiet tribute to the ancient art of peacemaking. But diplomacy wasn't reserved for kings. Hittite queens, particularly the powerful Pujahipa, played significant roles in foreign policy. Fluent in multiple languages, she corresponded directly with other monarchs, arranged royal marriages, and influenced international treaties. Her letters show a sharp mind, an iron will, and a sense of political grace rarely recorded in ancient sources. This wasn't just policy. It was ideology. The Hittites believed in a world held together by oaths and order, where promises had weight, and loyalty to the divine balance shaped behavior as much as fear or ambition. Their diplomacy was a reflection of their spiritual worldview. Agreements were not just between men, but between realms, human and divine. And in this, perhaps, lies the secret to their resilience. They did not simply conquer territory. They cultivated relationships. And in doing so, they built an empire that reached further than any chariot could ride, into the hearts and minds of nations, bonded not by force, but by trust carved into clay. In the dry heat of the Levant, where the Orontes River winds past dusty plains and distant mountains, two great empires once collided. It was not a battle of survival, but of supremacy, a contest to decide who would control the choke point between Asia and Africa, east and west. The place was Kadesh. The year was around 1274 BCE. And what followed was the largest chariot battle in recorded history. On one side, Ramesses II, pharaoh of Egypt, young, ambitious, armed with the prestige of his ancestors and the divine aura of living godhood. On the other, Muwatalli II, king of the Hittites, calm, calculated, commanding an army drawn from the vast and diverse lands of his empire. Kadesh was not a surprise encounter. It was the culmination of rising tensions between two empires with overlapping ambitions. Both wanted control of the vital trade routes that snaked through Syria, and Kadesh, perched like a jewel at the heart of it all, was the key. The Egyptian army marched north with over 20,000 men, including a formidable force of chariots, each with 2 riders. Ramesses divided his forces into 4 divisions, moving them separately across long, exposed roads, a mistake born of overconfidence. The Hittites, waiting patiently, used deception. Muwatalli had stationed his main force behind the city, hidden across the river, while sending out fake deserters to feed Ramesses false information. When the Egyptian divisions were spread thin and vulnerable, the Hittite chariots struck, 3,500 strong, thundering across the plain in a coordinated ambush. The initial blow was devastating. One Egyptian division was routed, another in disarray. Ramesses himself was caught unprepared, nearly overwhelmed. And yet, in one of history's most dramatic reversals, the pharaoh rallied his personal guard, held the line, and waited as reinforcements from the rear arrived just in time. The battle surged back and forth, a storm of wheels, hooves, arrows, and dust. Neither side could claim total victory. The Egyptians held the field by sunset, but the Hittites kept the city of Kadesh. Strategically, the battle was a stalemate, but in its legacy, it was extraordinary. Ramesses returned home and proclaimed a glorious triumph, commissioning sprawling temple reliefs that showed him single-handedly defeating thousands. But the Hittites told a different story, one of cunning, patience, and honor held. What matters most, though, is what came after. Roughly 16 years later, Egypt and Hattusa signed the world's first surviving peace treaty, a mutual pact of non-aggression, military cooperation, and respect. It was a rare moment in ancient history. 2 empires not annihilating one another, but choosing balance. Kadesh stands as a testament to both the brutality and the wisdom of ancient power. It shows the limits of war, the cost of ambition, and the beginning of something greater than victory, diplomatic peace through shared experience. And in the dust of that ancient battlefield, where thousands once charged into legend, the wheels of history turned, not just on who won or lost, but on how empires learned to coexist. In the great cities of the Hittite Empire, in the echoing halls of Hattusa and the quiet courtyards of village homes, there moved a presence often overlooked by history, the Hittite woman. She was not a queen cloaked in gold, nor merely a shadow behind her husband. In the Hittite world, women walked with purpose. They held property, spoke in legal contracts, and even advised kings. It begins in the home, where Hittite women managed more than just domestic life. They were central to agriculture, weaving, food production, and small-scale trade. Many controlled their own assets and could inherit land, an uncommon right in the ancient world. A woman's dowry remained hers, not absorbed into her husband's wealth, giving her a measure of economic autonomy. Marriage was seen not as a subjugation, but as a contractual partnership. Surviving Hittite laws speak of obligations, rights, and consequences that applied to both spouses. In the event of divorce, property could be divided, and custody of children was negotiable. These were not mere traditions. They were codified laws, backed by the authority of the king. Women also had access to the courts. If wronged, they could file complaints, call witnesses, and receive compensation. Some cases even involve women acting as guardians or trustees for others, proof of both literacy and legal sophistication. But their influence extended beyond private life. In the temples, priestesses conducted rituals alongside their male counterparts. They prepared offerings, sang hymns, interpreted omens, and presided over festivals. The religious world of the Hittites was not exclusive. It was shared, layered, and full of nuance. And at the highest levels of society stood women like Pujahipa, whose role in history is both remarkable and revealing. As queen, she was not a ceremonial figure. She issued royal seals, revised religious rites, corresponded with foreign leaders, and shaped the empire's diplomacy with her signature beside her husband's. Her letters reveal a voice that is firm, intelligent, and clear, not the echo of a king, but an equal partner in statecraft. Even in mythology, Hittite goddesses were complex, not just mothers and lovers, but warriors, judges, negotiators. The divine realm reflected the mortal one, a world of shared power, interdependence, and balance. This is not to say the Hittites were a gender-equal society by modern standards. Patriarchy was real, and power was not evenly distributed. But compared to their contemporaries, the scope of female autonomy in Hittite society stands out, practical, written, and respected. In the shadow of kings and warriors, a quieter strength endured. It raised families, guided rituals, shaped treaties, and kept the great machinery of empire turning. History may not have carved their names into stone, but the Hittite women left their mark in the clay, firm, deliberate, and lasting. Every empire is built on more than stone and story. It's built on exchange. The movement of goods, skills, ideas, and people. And though the Hittites are often remembered for their armies and treaties, it was their economy, steady, adaptable, and far-reaching, that truly held the empire together. The Hittite heartland in Anatolia was rich in natural resources. Forests blanketed the hills. Rivers cut through valleys, feeding fields of barley and wheat. But most prized of all was metal, particularly copper and tin, the essential ingredients of bronze. These raw materials, and the artisans who worked them, were the engines of empire. The Hittites didn't just mine metal, they crafted it with precision. Bronze weapons, tools, ceremonial daggers, jewelry, and religious implements flowed from workshops that lined the edges of city centers and temple complexes. Even early ironworking began here, centuries before iron would dominate warfare. Though still rare, Hittite blacksmiths were among the first to experiment with iron blades, treating them as sacred and often reserved for kings or the gods. But trade extended far beyond metal. Textiles were a major industry. Women, especially, played a central role in spinning, weaving, and dyeing cloth that would be sold or traded. Ceramics ranged from simple cooking vessels to elaborately painted urns used in rituals and burials. Timber, grain, livestock, honey, oil, wool, leather, salt, and even obsidian passed through their markets and storehouses. And as the empire expanded, so too did its reach. Caravans moved steadily through dusty trade routes, connecting Hittite cities to the ports of the Mediterranean, the bazaars of Babylon, and the mountain passes into the Caucasus. Alongside merchants traveled ideas, new gods, foreign languages, exotic art styles, and subtle shifts in taste and ritual. Trade was not free-flowing chaos. It was regulated, tracked, and protected. Clay tablets show inventories, receipts, tax codes, and import agreements. The Hittite state even employed overseers to manage grain storage and temple economies. In hard times, these granaries fed the population, a form of proto-social safety net grounded in pragmatic governance. One fascinating detail. There are records of Hittite kings sending craftsmen abroad to help build foreign temples, not as laborers, but as diplomatic gifts. These exchanges weren't just economic. They were political and spiritual, signs of shared respect and alliance. The economy was never isolated from religion or law. The gods were invoked in contracts, and rituals were performed before major trades. Markets had sanctified corners. Prosperity wasn't just a sign of good policy, it was a sign of cosmic favor. And through it all, the pulse of the empire beat in the rhythm of exchange. Carts rolling through city gates, scribes counting barley, forges glowing in the dusk, and distant voices bargaining over silver and livestock. It was not the roar of conquest, but the hum of daily life, the unseen force that kept the Hittite world moving. Great empires rarely collapse in a single moment. More often, they erode, quietly, gradually, until one day the walls are breached, the tablets stop being written, and the fires in the forges go cold. So it was with the Hittites. An empire built on diplomacy, ritual, and order fell not with a roar, but with a scattering of silence. By the late 13th century BCE, the signs were already there. The world was changing. Across the eastern Mediterranean, climate shifts led to crop failures, migrations, and unrest. Long-standing trade routes became more dangerous. Famine loomed. Populations strained under the weight of imperial demand. And like many great powers before and after, the Hittites found themselves overextended, too large to hold, too complex to govern, too fragile to adapt. But something else was stirring. From the sea came a force both mysterious and devastating, the Sea Peoples. We don't know exactly who they were. Perhaps displaced warriors, raiders, or refugees from collapsing regions. What we do know is that they descended on the coasts of the ancient world like a tide of chaos, overwhelming city after city, from Anatolia to Canaan to Egypt. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was abandoned, burned. Not conquered in a dramatic siege, but left behind, stripped of its archives, emptied of its rituals. The royal family disappears from the historical record. The temples fell silent. The treaties were no longer honored. The carved lions stood alone in the dust. It wasn't just Hutti. The entire Late Bronze Age world unraveled. Mycenae, Ugarit, Troy, all suffered decline or destruction within a short span of years. What followed was a dark age, a time of lost writing, shattered economies, and forgotten gods. But why? Was it war? Climate change? Earthquakes? Internal rebellion? Or all of it at once? Most scholars now believe it was a perfect storm, a convergence of pressures that fractured even the most organized empires. The Hittite system, so reliant on centralized power and sacred order, could not survive a world without stability. And yet, even in collapse, the Hittites did not vanish completely. In the south, Neo-Hittite kingdoms survived for centuries, preserving pieces of the language, art, and rituals. In foreign texts, Hutti remained a memory, a name spoken with respect or fear. And buried beneath the hills of Anatolia, the tablets waited. Intact, preserved by the very clay they were written on. The fall of the Hittite Empire is not a story of failure. It is a story of fragility, of how even the most enduring powers can crack when the world turns too quickly. It reminds us that no order, however sacred, is immune to change. But it also reminds us that memory is resilient. that even in silence, the past speaks. Empires fall, but cultures endure. In the wake of the Hittite collapse, the great capital of Hattusa was left in ruins. The palaces were cold, the temples empty, the clay tablets buried beneath layers of time. But the people, the language, the customs, the memory, did not disappear. They simply migrated. Southward, eastward, into the hills and valleys of northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, where they reshaped their identity into something new. These were the Neo-Hittite kingdoms. Small, regional states like Carchemish, Melid, Kuma, and Gergum rose from the ashes of empire. Though they lacked the vast reach and centralized power of old Hutti, they held tightly to the cultural threads of their ancestors. In their temples and palaces, we see continuity, the same iconography, the same storm gods, the same stylized lions and stone gates. Their rulers still bore Hittite names. They still prayed in Hittite dialects. They still wrote in Luwian hieroglyphs, a script once used only for monumental inscriptions in the empire's final years. These inscriptions, carved into stone steels and walls, now became central to preserving royal legacies. The Neo-Hittite cities were smaller, more agile. Their architecture was simpler, but their art retained that distinct blend of realism and myth, human figures beside animal guardians, God striding through cloud and flame. Life was local now, but still deeply symbolic. They also adapted. These were not frozen remnants of the past. The Neo-Hittite states engaged in new alliances and rivalries with rising powers like Assyria, Urartu, and Aram. They fought wars, negotiated treaties, and sometimes paid tribute in exchange for survival. Carchemish, in particular, became a beacon, a city where the memory of Hutti lived on with clarity. It served as a buffer state, a trading hub, and a spiritual center. Even after it fell to Assyria, its cultural influence lingered in the art and ritual of its conquerors. But by the 8th century BCE, the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, too, were slowly absorbed. Some were conquered. Others faded into the shifting mosaic of Iron Age politics. And once again, Hittite identity slipped into the background of history. Yet they never truly vanished. The gods of the Hittites found homes in new temples. Their language whispered beneath newer tongues. Their scripts appeared in places once thought unrelated. And when archaeologists uncovered their cities centuries later, they found not just ruins, but a continuity of spirit. The Neo-Hittites remind us that identity is not lost in collapse. It migrates. It evolves. It finds new soil in which to root itself. And so, in the quiet hills and broken walls of forgotten towns, the Hittites did not die. They echoed. For over 3,000 years, the Hittites lay forgotten. Their empire vanished from the pages of memory, their language unspoken, their gods unsummoned. Even the great cities, Hattusa, Carchemish, Alaka Hoyuk, became no more than grassy mounds beneath the Anatolian sky. Ancient writers mentioned the land of Hutti, but no one knew what it meant. It was a name without a people. Until the 19th century. In the age of steam trains and colonial expeditions, a new kind of explorer emerged, the archaeologist. Driven by a hunger to understand the ancient world, European teams began sifting through the ruins of the Middle East, looking for connections between myth, scripture, and stone. In 1834, a French explorer named Charles Texier stumbled upon something unexpected near the modern Turkish village of Bogazkale. Cyclopean walls, massive gates, and scattered sculptures buried under soil and silence. He believed he had found a lost Phrygian city. He was wrong, but the clues were starting to surface. Decades later, German archaeologists returned to the site and began systematic digs. They uncovered hundreds of clay tablets, still intact in their ancient archives, covered in unfamiliar cuneiform. It was clear now, this was not Phrygia. This was something older, something far more significant. And then, in the early 20th century, the breakthrough came. Scholars such as Bedřich Hrozný, a Czech linguist, began decoding the tablets. In 1915, he made a bold claim. The language was Indo-European. One phrase in particular, Nu ninduan ezatini, waterma ecutini, translated as, now you will eat bread and drink water. Simple. Human. Astonishing. The lost voice of the Hittites had returned. From that moment forward, a flood of understanding began. Hattusa was confirmed as their capital. The Treaty of Kadesh, long thought to be an Egyptian boast, was found in Hittite form. Royal correspondence between kings. Religious hymns. Law codes. Myths of storm gods and sea serpents. Thousands of tablets, piecing together the complex mosaic of Hittite civilization. And it wasn't just writing. Excavations revealed temples, granaries, forges, palaces, fortresses. Reliefs carved into rock faces. Hidden chambers beneath stone gates. Even landscaped ceremonial tunnels, likely used in sacred processions, all preserved beneath the dry soil of Anatolia. Suddenly, a forgotten empire was reborn, not in power, but in understanding. The rediscovery of the Hittites reshaped our view of the Bronze Age. It filled in the gaps between Egypt and Babylon, revealing a third great pillar of that ancient world, one ruled not by spectacle, but by structure. Not by legend, but by law. Not by immortality, but by endurance. And perhaps the most remarkable part? We didn't rediscover them through myth or rumor. We found them in the clay they left behind, in the very medium they trusted to carry their voice across time. And it worked. The Hittites spoke, patiently, softly, through the silence of centuries. History is a chorus of loud voices, the pharaohs, the Caesars, the empires that shout their triumphs across time. But sometimes the truest wisdom lies in the quieter civilizations, the ones whose strength was not in how loudly they ruled, but in how deeply they endured. The Hittites were one such people. They did not build wonders to scrape the sky. They didn't boast of immortality or demand worship of their kings. What they built instead was something more grounded, an empire of resilience, founded on law, diplomacy, ritual, and an unwavering belief in order. Their influence runs deeper than we often realize. In diplomacy, they left behind the oldest known peace treaty, not a myth, but a contract. An idea that conflict can end in mutual respect, that great powers can choose coexistence over conquest. In law, they practiced an evolving legal system that preferred reform over revenge, that gave women rights, valued property, and even accounted for animals and the land. It wasn't perfect. No ancient system was, but it was progressive in ways that still surprise us. In faith, they embraced complexity. Instead of crushing the gods of others, they absorbed them, creating a pantheon of 1,000 deities. They recognized that belief is layered, local, and deeply human. In language, they preserved the oldest written Indo-European tongue, a linguistic ancestor of many modern languages, carved into clay with steady hands and careful thought. And in architecture, they did not reach for the heavens. They built into the hills, blending with the land, shaping their cities to reflect the terrain, the sky, and the seasons. But perhaps the greatest part of their legacy is how they vanished and returned. For centuries, they were forgotten. their name erased, their cities buried. Yet they left just enough, a trail of clues etched in stone and clay, for us to find them again. Not as myths, but as people, flawed, thoughtful, organized, spiritual, and real. In rediscovering the Hittites, we are reminded of something vital. That history is not a straight line of winners and losers, kings and conquests. It is a vast branching forest of cultures, many unseen, many unspoken, that shape the world in quiet, lasting ways. And sometimes, the ones who whisper through time leave the clearest echoes. The Hittites were forgotten giants. But they walked tall. They walked wisely. And now, at last, we walk with them again.